Hello, and welcome to the first lecture for Christianity 125, or Introduction to Christianity. This lecture will introduce an overview of the course very quickly, and then we will jump into the first chapter in your textbook, Reading the Old Testament. I want to give you a brief introduction to me and my family. I'm Jennifer Bashaw, and these pictures are of me and my family, my husband Carrie, and my three boys, Noah, Riley, and Isaac. And that purple hair was just for one summer. I actually have dark brown hair, as you can see in the picture below. I hope I'll get to know you all as well as we continue through this course. Just to give an overview of Intro to Christianity, there's going to be 4 main units that we'll cover during this course. And the first one is on the Old Testament, or what is sometimes known as the Hebrew Bible or Jewish Bible. The second unit will be on the New Testament. The third one on church history, and this will cover a long period of time, from the early church history to modern day church history. And then we will finish with Christian theology, and we'll talk a little bit about the practices and beliefs of Christians throughout history and today. A brief note, this course will be taught from a Christian perspective, as Campbell does take seriously its Christian heritage, but we will try to be sensitive to the Jewish perspective found in the Old Testament. Just be aware that many of the things that we'll say throughout this course are professed by the Christian church, but maybe not other religions. To begin, I wanted us to start with an overview of the Christian scriptures, because our first 2 units will be on Christian scriptures, the Old Testament and the New Testament. And so this video is a YouTube video made by a group that has done an amazing job at making informational videos about the various books in the Bible, also topics in the Bible, and they're called the Bible Project. And we'll be watching some of these videos throughout the course. They are very well done and well researched. So we're going to take a look at this first video that is an overview of the Christian scriptures, including the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament and the New Testament as well.
The Bible. It's one of the most influential books in human history.
It explores the big questions of why we exist.
It's inspired many people to do amazing things.
And confused many others.
And you've probably got one sitting around somewhere.
So, what is the Bible actually?
Well, the Bible is a small library of books that all emerged out of the history of the people of ancient Israel. And in one sense, they were just like any other ancient civilization. But among them were a long line of individuals called prophets. And they viewed Israel's story as anything but ordinary. They saw it as a central part of what God was doing for all humanity. And these prophets were literary geniuses.
Really?
Yeah, they expertly crafted the Hebrew language to write epic narratives, very sophisticated poetry. They were masters of metaphor and storytelling, and they leveraged all of this to explore life's most complicated questions about death and life and the human struggle.
So, there's a lot of different authors writing this book.
Yeah, and these texts were produced over a 1,000-year period, starting with Israel's origins in Egypt, then leading up to their kingdom with their first temple, but eventually they were conquered by the Babylonians, who took them away into exile. Then, at a crucial moment in their history, many Israelites returned to their land. They built a second temple, they reformed their identity, and this is when the Jewish scriptures began to be formed into the shape that we have them today.
Okay, the Jewish Bible. What's in it?
Well, in Hebrew, it's called by an acronym, Tanakh. The T stands for Torah, sometimes called the Law. That's Israel's 5-book foundation story. The N stands for Nevi'im, the Hebrew word for prophets. And this section consists of the historical books that tell Israel's story from the prophet's point of view. Then you get the poetic books of the prophets themselves. The K stands for Ketuvim, the Hebrew word for writings. This is a diverse collection of poetic books, wisdom books, and more narrative. And the Jewish people believed that through all of these literary works, God speaks to his people.
Now, there were other Jewish writings being produced during this Second Temple period as well.
Yeah, a really diverse group of texts. And these too were highly valued in Jewish communities. And there was debate from ancient times about whether or not some of these should be considered part of their scriptures.
So, this is a lot of different writings over a long period of time. Why did they put them all together like this?
Well, altogether, these texts tell an epic story about how God is working through these people to bring order and beauty out of the chaos of our world. And it all builds up to a hope for a new leader who would come and renew all creation. And then the Tanakh concludes, and this leader never comes.
So it's an expertly crafted work, but it's missing an ending?
That's exactly right. Now, a few centuries later, a Jewish prophet comes onto the scene named Jesus of Nazareth. He claimed he was carrying the Tanakh story forward.
Yeah, so Jesus did a bunch of cool stuff, was killed, but his followers claimed he was alive from the dead.
Yeah, they said that Jesus was that long-awaited leader who would restore the world. And so his earliest followers, called apostles, they composed new literary works about the story of Jesus. They called these Good News, or the Gospel. They formed an account called Acts about the spread of the Jesus movement outside of Israel, and then they circulated letters to different Jesus communities all around the ancient world.
And they saw these writings as part of the scripture.
Yeah, the apostles wrote all of this as the fulfillment of that epic story found in the Tanakh, and they were continuing the literary genius of the Jewish tradition. They also believed that God was speaking to his people through these texts alongside the scriptures of Israel.
So that's the Old and New Testament. But what did the early Christians think of the other Second Temple literature?
Well, different groups had different views about some of these books, but we know they read them and valued these texts because they passed them along with the Jewish scriptures.
Okay, so we've got the Tanakh, the Jewish scriptures. We got these other Second Temple period works. Then the writing of the apostles about Jesus. And that's a lot of literature, so what's in my Bible?
So the Christian movement has taken different forms over 2,000 years, and from the beginning, all Christians recognized the Tanakh and the New Testament as scripture. And for centuries, much of the Second Temple literature was read as part of the biblical tradition. The Catholic Church eventually made it official and called some of the books from this collection the Deuterocanonical books. Some Orthodox churches used even more books from this Second Temple literature, and then in the 1500s, during the Reformation, Protestant Christians wanted to go back to the oldest writings of the prophets and apostles, so they accepted only the Old and New Testaments.
Okay, I think I got it. But how does a collection of books produced over 1,000 years by all these different authors tell one unified story?
Yeah, that's the question we'll address in our next video.
Hey, I'm John.
And I'm Tim.
Okay, so you see this is the overview of the Christian scriptures. I really enjoy these videos. I know sometimes they're cartoony, but please take them seriously because they give you a big picture of what's going on in the Christian scriptures, and really helps you to visualize the historical and literary background to these Christian scriptures. And so now we're going to get a little more in-depth and slow down from what the things you learned in the video said, and talk about the Tanakh first. So the Tanakh is the name that Jews call their Jewish Bible, and the Tanakh is named that because of the three divisions of the books. So there are 24 books total in the Jewish Bible, in the Tanakh. The first section is Torah, which is a word that means teaching, but often we'll translate it as law. You will hear Christian scholars call the Torah the Pentateuch, Penta for the 5 books that comprise the Torah. The second section is the Nevi'im, and these are the books of the prophets. And in Christianity, we tend to think of the prophets as being the people like Hosea and Ezekiel, which is true. But in the Jewish Bible, they also look at the books like Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel as prophets. And so they call those books the former prophets. And then the latter prophets would be the ones we typically think of as the prophets. So the Nevi'im. And then the third division is the Ketubim, which is a diverse collection of writings, and many of these writings are poetic in nature, and so we will look at those different books and also the dates that these were canonized here in a little bit. For those of you who are curious, the word Tanakh comes from the first letter of each of the divisions. So the T from the Torah, the N from the Nevi'im, and the K from the Ketuvim. And that's an acronym that we translate into Tanakh. You will see it sometimes without the H on the end, and sometimes with the H on the end. So the same books in the Christian faith are called, we call them the Old Testament. And they are the same writings, but divided differently. So we have 39 books in the Christian Old Testament, which are actually the same books in the Jewish Bible, but the scroll, which contains all of the prophets, is just one book in the Jewish Bible. So our 4 divisions in the Christian Old Testament are the Pentateuch, which is the same as the Torah, the first 5 books, and then books of history, which do include the writings like Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. We have wisdom writings, which involve the books of Proverbs and Job and Psalms, among others. And then our last division is the prophets, and these prophets include the prophetic books that we typically think of, books like Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and all the minor prophets. The Old Testament, or Jewish Bible, is a very diverse collection of literature, so you'll find very many different literary forms. Predominantly, the Jewish Bible is made up of narrative or stories, but there's also large chunks of law or legal materials. You'll have books that focus on history, and these very often are narrative as well, but that are more focused on trying to report some historical events. There's a great deal of poetry, not just in the poetry books, but scattered among the narratives. Wisdom literature is a specific genre that you will find in the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible, and then prophecy is one of the last major literary forms. What this means is that it's often difficult to interpret the Jewish scriptures without being familiar with the different features of these different genres. So it's important to know when you're reading through scripture exactly what genre you're reading, because there are different ways to responsibly read these different literary forms or genres. One of the background issues that is important for us to understand as we read through the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, is that there is a key event in Jewish history around which all of the other events and all of the literature sort of rotate or orbit. So we would say Israel's formational event really was not the creation in Genesis or the flood or the calling of Abraham in Genesis, but actually the Exodus. The Exodus was a formational, major event in the history of the Jewish people, and it is a key theme that gets repeated all throughout the Old Testament as you're reading the prophets and other things. The reason this is so central is because this is the time period when Israel really became a people. They solidified their identity as a distinct people, and they became known to themselves as the people of God. One literary way you can tell that the Exodus is very important to the Jews and to the overarching story of Christianity as well is that it takes 4 whole books in the Jewish Bible to tell the story of the Exodus. Genesis, in contrast, is a book that covers hundreds, maybe even 1,000 years of history, or 1,000 years of history. But when you get to the Exodus, which is really only about a 40-year event, it takes 4 whole books, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, to tell the story. So in that, you can see how important it was to the story of Israel, to their identity, that they told it sort of in different ways and from different perspectives. in order to cover really all the meaning that comes out of the Exodus. It was also, historically speaking, a crux for Israel.